Welcome to our class on industrial ecology and the circular economy. What I'd like to do with this first class is just to sort of give you an introduction into the topic and give you a bit of an outline in terms of what it may be comprised of. So with that, two, not just definitions, but two overviews of the concept of both industrial ecology and the circular economy. You have to think of industrial ecology as dealing with the ecosystem of industrial operations. So it really looks at not just what happens within a particular facility or within a particular company, but what's the interplay between various companies and various industries. And can there be an exchange that is analogous to what you see in biological systems? So with that, it's about material recovery, reuse in the extraction, supply, and manufacturing stages, material efficiency, energy efficiency, industrial symbiosis, which is the exchange of materials, with the goal of having maximum material and energy utilization in all business activities before the sale of the product. So in essence, it covers extraction, supply chain, and manufacturing. The circular economy then is the interplay between, if you will, society, the general public, and industry, whereby you're looking at what happens with society's discard of used products, and can there be a way of capturing those and allowing the reintroduction of those materials back into the supply chain or into manufacturing, which of course reduces the need for extraction from the earth. So it's about the use phase, recovery, recycling, reuse, and so on. All of those things essentially are the conceptual definitions of what we'd like to pursue in this course. Now, industrial ecology more broadly, as I said before, is a biomimicry effort. It's trying to look at what happens in the natural ecosystems to see if that can't be applied to the industrial sector. So part of it is to use input materials that are sustainable, renewable, sustainable sources, and of course, encourage industrial symbiosis. What is either your own byproduct or somebody else's byproduct can either be used by yourself or your byproducts could be used by somebody else. The other, of course, is just to eliminate waste. You want to have a situation whereby you want to be as efficient as possible with that material. And that's so you'll have sort of efficient processes, energy efficient processes. And then once you're as optimal as possible using the best systems, the best chemistries, the best processes out there, you then want to see if you can reuse and recycle those materials. And of course, the third piece, of course, is to make socially useful and non-harmful products, which has not always been the case. So for the circular economy, then it's literally, again, as I mentioned before, the recovery and reuse of those materials. So when we're talking about sustainable inputs, preferably they would be from resources that are derived from recovered or used products. So there's a potential for reverse logistics. And again, the definition of that is where companies proactively go into the marketplace and recover used products and allow them to reincorporate those into new products. Of course, it aligns with your elimination of waste in terms of reusing and recycling. And of course, your products themselves are now manufactured from the materials that had been previously used by someone else or by yourself, but have been recovered and reused. So basic question is, why am I interested in this? And obviously I go back a few years and there has been an evolution, as with all things. In the early 70s, I recognized that process changes are more powerful and more cost effective than end of pipe treatment. And so therefore, it was a clear early notion about trying to not to think about environmental issues as just waste treatment systems, but thinking about them more holistically and looking at resources, looking at the efficiency of your manufacturing operations, and looking at what happens with the byproducts, the waste that comes from that in a different way. So again, that was, again, the first kernel of thought around there. In the late 70s, I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, and I clearly recognized that government, while they would identify it and talk about it, they weren't going to legislate or push the issue of process improvements, probably for some time. And again, part of that was the fundamental philosophy that exists in the US, which is that government stays out of internal business operations. In the 1980s, both with the EPA and with industry, I recognized that Superfund had a profound effect on companies. What we saw, of course, was that companies generated an awful lot of waste. And with that waste and their hazardousness and the toxicity came a lot of problems with contaminated groundwater, contaminated water sources, contaminated soils, problems with public health and environmental health across the board. This did essentially catch the attention of senior executives, primarily because it was tens of millions of dollars, big money, going to something that they really hadn't thought about much before. Now, the unfortunate downside was it did push incineration to sort of cut this off. But once the money was invested in incineration, it made it difficult to justify the costs to be put into recycling. So sometimes you need to be careful and thoughtful in a systematic way as to what the impacts are of acting. At some level, you could say that at least acting, was able to reduce and eliminate the adverse impacts we saw prior to that. In the 1990s, recognized that you could understand processes and manufacturing processes through material balances. You could get a better effect. You could reduce the problems with quality. You could reduce the problems with environmental issues if you had management systems. So it really was a question of putting in structured programs. We predicated that on life cycle assessments. There was an analysis of the waste that demonstrated that could be used to think about what happened with the inputs and could be used as inputs elsewhere, and started to follow the industrial ecology literature. And to be fair, I was introduced to that by Brad Allenby. And he essentially contacted me, and we started to have a discussion about what that meant and what that could do with industry. And it was something he was promoting. And of course, he had a book and he was promoting his book. I adopted this as my department's philosophy at that point, but it was a battle. I mean, to think about a situation where you were going to eliminate waste was sort of beyond the pale, beyond what people could even begin to think about. In the aughts, in the change of this century, the idea was to convince management of the need for industrial ecology, and of course, to another extent, circular economy. I did that through incorporating that in vision, goals, metrics, targets, a framework, an architecture of what we were trying to accomplish, where industrial ecology was part and parcel of that. And then, of course, since 2010, companies are starting to discuss these issues very seriously, with the understanding that our bottom line is we're running out of resources. And of course, waste from industry are poisoning and polluting the planet. And not just impacting public health and environmental health, but reducing biodiversity, reducing the number of species, which ultimately is going to be to our own demise. Now, in terms of the specifics, I was part of the environmental research lab at Dow Chemical in the early 70s with the goal, with our objective of putting in new waste treatment systems. So as an example, I was asked to put together essentially the equivalent of incineration in liquids. So it was called the Omnivore, and we tried to have a system that would reduce all organic materials to essential elemental components through the use of high pressure, high temperature. It was catalyzed, low pH, all the classic things that people do about forcing the effort. Tantalum, titanium. At the end of the day, it was very, very expensive, and it was just not going anywhere. With some frustration, I sat down with other members of the team, and we started talking about, the real issue here, which was the process. We were, at that point, we were all chemical engineers. We were a little upset that the processes were not as efficient as we thought they could be. And so therefore, we took a different tact, which was to go to management and say, look, let's see if we can't change the manufacturing process. Now, these days, it might be more difficult. Back then, we had in-house design teams, in-house manufacturing teams, construction teams, and that was able to proceed at an extraordinarily quick pace for again, one or two small facilities, small plant manufacturing plants. And what we found with that, of course, as we expected, was that you were much more efficient, you used less input material, you generated less waste, and of course, we changed the toxicity, the hazardous nature of the waste. And as a result, we saved a lot of money. So obviously, the expectation that we all had was that, the company would, run to this one and, raise the flag, ring the bell, and, pat us on the back. But of course, the reality was anything but that. I think, to be fair, we really failed to understand the political nature of what we were doing. We really offended the other research operations. We upset manufacturing. And so as a result, they made a decision to sell the research lab off. It actually had value. The people in that were actually relatively qualified, and so therefore off they went to a consulting firm called Hydroscience. Now, Dow brought the concept back later, but I think they had lost the momentum at that point, so it was never quite as effective. So I then went off, of course, worked in pharmaceuticals, and this is just an outline of the life cycle in pharmaceuticals, and we'll talk about life cycles as we go, but I want to give you some idea of what there were out there. So for extraction for us, although senior management thought we were out there clipping plants around the world, the reality, of course, is the chemicals we utilized were derived from petrochemicals, petroleum. It was oil. Essentially, that was the starting block for all of what we did, that and brine, and away it went, chlorine chemistry. Supply chain, of course, was the range of commodity chemicals that came from that, solvents, catalysts, starting materials, binders, all these things were provided by other companies, from a number of different sources. Primary manufacture, because of the complexity of the chemistry, complexity of the molecule, you're usually a half dozen to a dozen different individual chemical steps, which made, again, half dozen to a dozen intermediates at each step to make the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So that was the essence of the medicine. Secondary manufacturing was adding binders and fillers to make the pill, often the packaging, and away it went. Now, we had industrial symbiosis opportunities at both operations, and primarily because we used an awful lot of solvent that, of course, could be recovered, could be redistilled and reused. And so there was a real effort and a battle, to be fair, about this, because people and plant manufacturers were concerned about using materials that were seen as waste. And we had to really work hard to get them to recognize that there were real opportunities there if we used specifications, worked with the FDA, all that sort of thing. Then, of course, packaging had two, of course, drivers. We wanted to be marketable. We were concerned about being tamper resistant, had to be protective of the product. Although it wasn't necessarily consumer marketing driven, they still wanted a relatively attractive packaging presentation. Of course, our role was to meet all those objectives, but also minimize the amount of packaging that was required. Then, of course, beyond that, distribution, first to big wholesalers, then to regional distributors and to pharmacies. We did some life cycle assessments and found that we could, of course, ship this directly to patients, not just eliminating those middlemen, which of course would have happened, but it also minimized the energy required, where the big element of that was the patient literally driving from their house to the pharmacy and back again, which was really a significant component of the energy required to even make the material in itself. Now, for reverse logistics, what happened in terms of a circular economy? Not much in the US. We did have unused medicine recovery in the EU. But the real opportunity for some of the consumer products was in the recovery of the packaging, of the bottles that came in. So I'll talk about that later. But that's the essence of a life cycle in pharmaceuticals. You'll have to make a determination of what your life cycle is for your product. And essentially, we'll go through the steps, and you'll essentially take the steps to look at what could be done in each of those steps, again, to achieve an industrial ecology principle in your industry, what could be done to implement the circular economy and what that meant in terms of the overall life cycle. And I think one of the things that you'll find, and one of the question marks I've had in prior classes is, why did it take so long? Why don't industries do this sort of thing? And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that is. And part of that are the things that are on this list. Clearly, the things that drive corporate activity. Now, usually, people start with the first two and stop with the first two. It's about money and reputation. Save the corporation money, enhance the reputation, life is good. But there's also a personal component to it as well as the company component. So people clearly want to make their bonuses. They want to keep their jobs. And so therefore, that is a factor in all of this. Reputation depends on what the investment analysts are promoting at the time, but it can be a relatively big issue. The status quo is something that I think people overlook. And you have to recognize that when you're promoting something that's new and different, especially with the new technology, the existing staff might not have the expertise to deal with it. So therefore, you're threatening their situation. You're upsetting the apple cart. The site manager has to essentially redo all of his or her objectives. And all of those things essentially challenge the status quo. And even though there could be money in it for both the personal and for the company, people are reluctant to do it because of the risk involved with that. The other component of personal politics, and I don't want to minimize this, there clearly are political issues that go on within a company in terms of how people get ahead. And if one person can make another person look bad and allow that first person to be promoted, well, then they won't necessarily sometimes hesitate to stick a knife in someone's back. So you need to be at least sensitive and aware to this issue in terms of why things don't happen. Now, what I want to do before we get into this general discussion about industrial ecology is talk a bit about sustainability. And the elevator pitch, of course, is it's the preservation of the human species. It's our survival, just that simple. Now, it can be broken down. It's a systems approach. And so therefore, the classic three pillars of sustainability are the environmental, the social, and economics, the triple bottom line. And this essentially means that we have to move away from a linear economy. This, of course, is from McDonough and Braggart, that essentially you take, make, and dispose and throw things away. Hopefully something useful comes out of it, but essentially it is a recipe for disaster for the planet, especially on a finite planet. Now, a circular economy says that there are ways to essentially recover technical nutrients, usually metals, minerals, that sort of thing, inerts, and biologicals. Both of those things can be recovered if we understand how to do that and we understand the needs of manufacturing and designing the product, which we'll get into. So the criteria for sustainability, and sometimes it is seen in a range of issues. It can be everything from classic environmentalism to social equity, women's rights, equitable share of resources, consumerism, peace movement. But it really is a multidisciplinary approach to ensure human survival. It requires the expertise in a range of different areas. And of course, a number of different people have to be willing to essentially come to work in this area. Now, the thought catalyst starts perhaps before Malthus, but let's just pick Malthus as a convenient starting point, where he said, look, the population will continue to grow until either we outrun our food source or we'll die of disease because we're just overcrowded. And of course, because of a number of things that have happened since Malthus, he has been somewhat discredited, but on a theoretical standpoint, I think he was right. Clearly, the population of any species will continue to expand until you hit natural limits. And just because we've been able to be innovative and thoughtful about surmounting those limits doesn't mean that at some point we may not hit those. So we have to think about that. The conservation movement, of course, sort of in the early 1900s, late 1800s, was about preserving or conserving. How do you essentially deal with, again, the finite resources we have? And so there was a battle back and forth. In the 60s, environmental concerns relative to pollution essentially gathered the public imagination. So therefore, there was a major effort in terms of putting controls on to protect both public and environmental health. However, a little bit later on, Limits to Growth came out, which is a book. We'll talk a bit about that perhaps, which essentially said, look, we have to recognize that there is going to be a scarcity of resources in the future, and not the distant future either, when they first put it out in the 70s, but sometime, within this century. And so a big question mark came in terms of, can we allow ourselves as a global society to continue to grow? A common future was a research effort put on by the UN. Gro Harlem Brundtland, of course, championed that, spearheaded and managed that. And I think the focus there was more about responsible growth. We need to understand the needs that we all have. We need to act today in a way not to adversely affect future generations. Put in a nice, soft, cuddly way. We need to be thoughtful about the environment. We need to be thoughtful about the equitable distribution of resources. And it was essentially relatively well received. John Elkington, of course, then came up with a triple bottom line in terms of how we can think about survival of the species, sustainability. So going through the different elements, environmental sustainability clearly is about resources. It's moving away from linear consumption, elimination of reserves, to a more circular exchange of resources, sustainable input. Pollution itself, of course, needs to be eliminated and dealt with. You can have efficient processes, and whatever you can't essentially design out, you have to think about how you can use those more effectively. Product stewardship. Products aren't always designed with a concern for the end of life impacts, and so therefore, the designer of the product has to be mindful of both the fate and the effect of the used product and how it can be reincorporated back into the circular economy. Social sustainability is a laundry list, great long list. You can start with a couple. Consumption, of course, what is enough, what's needed. And then, of course, you have the issues of social, racial, and justice in terms of broad equity. Will people be allowed globally to obtain what they need? Will there be discrimination in different communities? And does the structure of our communities hinder or aid sustainability? And of course, one of the things that usually isn't talked about are issues around war and peace. But nonetheless, those are usually three big issues that people talk about. The thing that's coming up now is the impact from technology. And we're starting to see that with respect to blue collar workers. We're seeing robots replacing the usual factory, line staff. They're just more and more machines that can replace people. And so therefore you have this decline of job opportunities for blue collar workers. And of course, society's challenge will be, how do we essentially deal with those people with respect and dignity that they deserve in a way that allows them to make contributions to society, not just live off the dole, although there could be guaranteed annual incomes that support even that effort. The other one that's going to potentially affect us as college graduates will be artificial intelligence. And at some level, there is a possibility of replacing white collar workers. And of course, the classic question is, what's left and how do we cope with that? And what should be reasonable leisure time, what's idle time, and how are we going to, again, be, treated with respect and dignity and make contributions to society. So these are some of the challenges I think we face with social responsibility and social sustainability. Economic sustainability happens perhaps at two levels. We've been talking about companies, and so therefore companies see sustainability perhaps differently from their own perspective than you would from a 10,000 foot view for society. So obviously they ask the classic competitive questions. Will there be advantage in the marketplace? Can you make your product with less resource and no waste? Is that possible? Risk management, of course, is big, which is loss avoidance. Cost control, it's the eco-efficiency issue. Can you actually convert eco-efficiency into bottom line benefits? Can you then incorporate sustainability into reliable supply chains? And are there resource limits? And can you derive a benefit from finding sustainably sourced materials? So that's the company standpoint. The problem, of course, comes in the societal level with population. Population, of course, is growing exponentially. And if it continues like this, we know that Malthus may ultimately be proven right. However, one of the things that we see is that since the 1960s, the world population growth rate, not the absolute amount, but the rate of growth, has been declining significantly, so that we're getting very close to replacement levels throughout the world, not just within the developed world, but even in the developing world. So, and it really depends on what happens with the population. If we retain our current constant fertility, we look like to hit about 30 billion people. That, of course, is just untenable. We don't believe that the planet can sustain that. Even with high projections, we're talking about over doubling what we have right now. Medium, it might flatline and increase to over 10 billion. With a low, it might go and come back down to about where we are right now, to about 7.5 billion people. Probably not a great deal of hope for a low projection. A lot of opportunities for medium projection. Of course, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals allow to achieve that. And of course, the high levels are what happens if we do nothing. We just sit back and say that the world's always going to be this way. Again, getting back to the company viewpoint, investor pressures are out there, and so therefore they're interested because they see that as a component of how you can be successful in the future. The social contract, of course, is all about your reputation, and there's usually general talk about license to operate, but this is a real intangible thing. If companies essentially violate that contract, they essentially will be ostracized and excluded from society's ability to interface in the marketplace. So therefore, you have a lot of stakeholder interest and pressure, shareholder pressure, and therefore the question is, will there be access to products at an affordable price? And of course, the macro consideration, as I mentioned before, can we continue to grow indefinitely? We've seen the impacts of population, but what does that mean broadly? How do we deal with the financial system? How do we deal with banks? How do we deal with the stock market if growth is essentially curtailed because the population is going to be curtailed? So obviously, a lot of focus from companies is the bottom line profits, which is usually why industrial ecology has taken off. There's real opportunities for benefit from profits in that regard, but with a broader understanding that companies can't succeed if society fails. So obviously, the causes for growth: technology allows for increased wealth. Technology allows for improved education, and there's a symbiotic relationship there. It goes in both directions. Education enhances technology. Technology is used to increase food production, and of course, it's used to improve health. And that, of course, always lies to this range in terms of what we expect in terms of population with reduction in growth rates. So, summary: growth has allowed for improvements in average well-being. It's average. Some people have suffered because of this, of course. Industrialization, urbanization has all happened with both, again, positive and negative effects from that. And you have threats in terms of both the environmental, but also the social threats. And of course, just resource and economic threats that come from that. So we have issues there. So the growth dynamics, sustainable development now hopes for enhanced global living conditions, and there are pent-up growth needs for the developing world. And of course, those impacts are going to be that as the poor essentially are brought out of poverty, they're going to take more resources. It's just going to be a natural impact. And with that will come, the natural environmental effects from that. Now, this is why, of course, the UN has put together the Sustainable Development Goals. They've been in place for over 5 years now. But just give you an example of no poverty. That looks obviously like an altruistic piece. It's something we should do. We should try to do everything we possibly can to bring people out of poverty. But the other side benefit of that is we've seen that as people come out of poverty, the interesting analog is that they reduce the size of their families. So there's a positive benefit from that. And again, if we allow to continue, obviously our global GDP is 91 trillion, population is 7.2. The average output per person is about $12,000 per year. The average income per capita in the developed world is 36,000. The average income in the developing world is $7,000. So if we brought everybody up to the $36,000 a year increase, that means our new GDP goes from 91 trillion to 273 trillion, threefold increase. And that also means there's no economic growth in the developed world. That strikes me as being almost politically untenable and certainly impossible to imagine. So obviously it's a massive increase for the world past its major planetary boundaries. The factor in population growth, probably about 9.6 billion by 2050, or about a 33% increase, 10.8 billion by 2100, which is sort of that mid-range projection as I mentioned before. But that means that by 2050, in order to achieve a global income of 36,000, the GDP goes to 363 trillion, 4 times current levels, still no growth in the developing world. So there's going to be an incomplete catching up in that regard. So this is, of course, the hurdle, the challenge that I think global society faces. And it's going to slow in terms of its ability to achieve parity. So obviously the income gap needs to be closed. You have to use existing technologies and business models. And if you do that, humanity will just burst through the seams for our planetary boundaries. So therefore, we have to develop in a fundamentally different way. Now, this is the master equation. Chernow came up with this back in 2001. It's a conceptual model. It's not an absolute mathematical equation, but essentially what he's saying is that the environmental impact, in the globe is equal to the population times its influence, i.e. the resources they consume, times the technology change that reduces that impact or increases it, one or the other. But as a result of that, what it says is that the trends are pretty well understood, that the population is going to increase by 1.5 times, 6 to 9, 7 to 9 billion, 33% increase. The affluence has to increase by a factor of 2 to 3 to achieve the UN's SDGs. And therefore, as a result, the technology improvements have to be significant. There has to be a decrease in the environmental impact by somewhere between 65 and 80%. And that's why they call it a factor 4 or factor 10, an order of magnitude difference in the technology impact. So obviously, we have a challenge in terms of dealing with that. The other piece with economic sustainability, of course, is, and Herman Daly is the key proponent of this in terms of the things I've read, is that economic growth as we know it comes to an end. We can't have continuing growth on and on and on, or we'll reach those planetary boundaries. And so therefore, he recognizes that economic growth has to come to a conclusion at some point. But he's saying, look, it's not about stopping all activity. Design of products can improve. A single region can grow, but only relative growth. And so therefore, it's a zero-sum game. And improvements made by an individual company that are sustainable will be rewarded over those other companies. So if you find something that's more environmentally sensitive, more sustainable, you should be able to be more prosperous over your competition. And natural capital needs to be separated from man-made capital. Weak sustainability, of course, and strong sustainability are debated. Weak sustainability are classic cases, fish stocks are low, build more boats. It really is meant to essentially say, we'll be able to find something else, just keep on looking. Strong sustainability essentially says, look, there are limits to what we can do. The substitution is limited, the ability to come up with more. So therefore, we need to manage the fishing to align with that replacement. So he's essentially saying, our fixed stock of resources is running out, runs through an hourglass. At some point, we have to go back and recognize to be converted to waste. So therefore, waste in the future will be our only resource, and we need to be thoughtful about how that happens. Now, his challenges are sometimes difficult. He's saying taxes need to be put on goods so people consume only what they need. They don't go out and buy many, many things. So therefore, it's an aggressive tax. Employment has to move from the building of materials to maintaining and repairing products. And happiness has to be essentially not related to our consumption of goods. So the limits on sufficiency, we should be happy with the things we have and not continue to just acquire for its own sake. So he sees a move to a service economy where things are not necessarily owned but used as they're needed. So therefore, more things are shared. And again, it's the sharing economy. Um, there are limits in terms of how the GDP grows, even here. So the poor still need physical goods, clothing, shelter, food. What happens with the financial sector? It could atrophy because there'd be no need for it. And free trade are going to be difficult if some are and some aren't sustainable. And unfortunately, there can be cases where the unsustainable, actors in the play are going to continue. Tim Jackson, also a professor interested in sustainable development, not sustainability, but he argues for the same thing. Growth benefits the rich. Poor companies need economic development. So he's looking for some type of prosperity without growth. He calls it a decoupling. He just said, look, as a society, global society, we are just addicted to growth. It's embedded in everything we do, almost to the point where it's almost invisible from any type of analysis. So he also calls for a service economy, and he also thinks it could happen more at a community level. I have to admit, I have some reservations about this. There are things that can be done much more efficiently at a global level than reproducing that multiple times over and over again in individual countries and individual regions within those countries. So I think there are limits to this, but nonetheless, this is what he's been proposing. Bill McKibben, of course, focuses on climate change. He references limits to growth, which of course is natural. He said spiked oil prices is going to be the first indicator of problems. Of course, that has not come to pass. Even with the pandemic, gas prices are exorbitantly low. It's almost a barrel of oil has a negative value. And so talks about local energy production. Of course, that could be possible with wind power, solar panels, but there are limits even to that. And he argues for industrial symbiosis to reflect natural cycles. So, all those are good things. The question is, how do we then implement that? So basic question for economic sustainability will be, how will growth end and why would it end? First, of course, will be a depletion of resources, the proliferation of negative environmental impacts, and then, of course, financial disruptions. The problem is that if we just close our eyes to this and let it happen, the endpoint will be apocalyptic. It will be absolutely horrible. So obviously, the call to action in these areas are to be more thoughtful and more mindful of what could happen if we don't take action now. And that's usually what most people are thinking about with climate change and sustainability. So that's the overview. Obviously, economic sustainability looks at both population impacts and growth. Social sustainability looks at consumption, equity, and technology impacts, and environmental sustainability of resources, waste, and products. So having gone through that, let's see if we can't tackle the issues of industrial ecology. What is it? Obviously, usually people think about environment and environmental management as treatment. It's a bolt-on to existing systems. Its goal is local risk management, waste from individual sites. And you have to understand that this type of approach is seen as an overhead. And so therefore, companies try to minimize this as much as possible, which is why governments usually have to regulate this area. The discipline is, again, fairly focused. People like me, environmental professionals, engineers, can put those systems together, operate them. Systems are relatively simple. Industrial ecology requires a built-in approach. It is more around sustainability. It's much more systematic in its focus, looking at all aspects of the life cycle. It's also looking more strategically on economic impacts. Its discipline is myriad. I mean, you really do need a number of people involved. And as a result of all of these things, this system, this approach is very complex. Now, obviously you talk about, what are our options? Status quo, it's really one, just linear use. We just continue to consume resources in linear fashion, the way it goes. And to be fair, I've talked to a lot of people in companies, and that's what they'd love to do. And they said, look, there are always going to be resources. We'll always find something else. It's like the frontier mentality. There's always something beyond the next hill. The reality, of course, is that at some point in time, that just can't happen. There will be new finds, there will be new ways of extracting resources from the planet, but there are limits. So therefore, one option is radical, or what's sometimes called deep ecology. And this is very popular when I was in college, which is, you know, shun civilization, shun society, go back to land, go back to nature, and just live simply. The problem, of course, is that we couldn't survive. The population that exists now, strictly on just one effort of, converting nitrogen to a fertilizer, constitutes, if you will, the ability of the planet to sustain about 1/3 of the population. So pursuing this would essentially condemn probably in the neighborhood of 3 billion people to death. That's not going to happen. People aren't going to voluntarily put their hand up to that. So industrial ecology is really, it's predicated on innovation. You really have to be thoughtful. You have to think differently in terms of how it's going to happen. Look at resources, look how they're used, how they can be reused, and how you can fit into a more of a biomimicry natural cycle. It applies to all of our operations. It is a systems approach, and it is a possible answer to both limits to growth and our common future. In terms of the elevator summary, it's aligning industry with natural environmental cycles. And as I mentioned before, more extensively, you look at sustainably sourced inputs. You want to make sure you generate no waste, either by generating byproducts for other uses or having no impacts. And you create products that are all themselves integrated into natural cycles. So the question is always out there, can we be more efficient? Can we better manage risk? Can we be sustainable with respect to all the pressures that we see on the environmental, social, and economic side? And where's the sweet spot, and how are we going to find it, and how are we going to deal with it? There has been an evolution in terms of how companies think about this. First, it was all about risks, and so therefore it was driven by compliance and risk. And then it got into a broader issue, as I said before, back in the 70s and 80s, and all that other issue in terms of other looking at different approaches, creating those opportunities, and then providing leadership. And I think, for the most part, that's where a lot of people are at this point in time. But nonetheless, there are still a number of companies that are still struggling in that first block of compliance. Now, in terms of the evolution of the concept, probably started in 1970. There was a journal called Industrial Ecology, but it really was more a focus of the impact of industrial activities on nature. So it really wasn't on point. In 72, however, MITI, Ministry of Industry and International Trade, came up with the metaphor of structuring the industrial system into more of a natural system, a systematic dematerialization, again, replacing material resources with technology. There was a discussion in Belgium about material and energy flows, the concept of waste. And in 89, in Scientific American, there was a first call, which I think probably is more on point to where we are now, that industrial systems could be efficient if the material flows are modeled after natural systems. There's also a recognition, I probably as an aside, through a lot of our processes, we tend to apply either temperature or pressure to overcome natural limitations and move an equilibrium reaction to completion. But there are different approaches, and nature can show us the way. Enzymatic solutions are clearly one of those. In the 80s and 90s, there was a call and cry for design for the environment. But this was, again, more of a tail end. Let's make sure we don't just throw our waste all over the place. In the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavian countries, they published sustainability plans. The Netherlands in 89 said we can achieve sustainability in 1 generation, which is 20 years. Unfortunately, that wasn't accomplished, but it was a good effort. And there are some things that have come out subsequent to that that hopefully will allow it to happen, hopefully with a bit more realistic timetable. The Business Council for Sustainable Development, the BCSD, looked at trying to bring industry into this, and make sure we created a dialogue within all of industry about how we can grow and develop and deal with environmental issues and resources. So this is very positive. Then in 1994, probably there was, again, more of a refined focus on industrial ecosystems and industrial ecology, primarily between the US and Japan. And thinking back then, don't forget Japan was where China is today, a major player in the production of products. So in a workshop in 92 in Snowmass in Colorado, there was a volume of papers that were collected that looked at industrial ecology and global change. So clearly much more on point. And then of course, you had Allenby and others essentially promoting this particular issue. So since the Industrial Revolution, obviously we're just out there, we extract it and we dispose of it. Resources were seen as limitless. Waste assimilation by the environment was seen as limitless. But we recognize that industries operated in a bit of a web. And input materials are seen as either inorganic, the technical nutrients, or organic, which are the biological nutrients. A disposed product usually winds up someplace in the environment. There's resource sinks that are either the landfills, incinerators, pumped into the air, dumped on the land, air, water, sometimes winding up in your body. And so therefore, the historical focus is always about meeting the needs of the customer and not always good at recognizing other consequences. And of course, Dr. Wei of Princeton essentially noted, here are things that were found at one point in time that were seen as absolute miracles. Chlorofluorocarbons essentially placed, ammonia refrigerants, and we needed non-toxic, non-flammable, and CFCs did the job. However, now we found out they created ozone holes in the stratosphere. Engine knock dealt with tetraethyl lead. I mean, it's sort of hard to believe that we would put lead in gasoline and let it, spew out the tailpipes so people, and unfortunately children, could breathe it in, which caused brain impairment. DDT was seen as the miracle in terms of dealing with mosquitoes and the subsequent issues on malaria, of course, because they were adverse to egg development in birds and some reproduction in mammals. It was banned. And of course, there's still a lot of debate about the impact on people from the cessation of DDT and the impacts that malaria has caused in a number of countries and a number of continents. I mentioned before about the issues around nitrogen fertilizer. Fritz Haber, chemist in Germany, won the Nobel Prize for developing this. And part of this came out of sort of an embarrassing meeting he had in a scientific conference. So he proved to go out. Now, Fritz unfortunately also developed mustard gas for the Germans in World War I, and Zyklon B, which was the killing agent that was used for the final solution in the gas chambers and places like Auschwitz for Jewish people and all other members of society that the Germans did not feel were appropriate to exist anymore. So Fritz had is a very, very ambivalent history. And as a result, his name has been tarnished. So the old thinking, industrial systems and natural systems are separate and apart and independent. The new thinking, of course, is we're located within natural systems. And it's interesting how this has all evolved. I mean, you go to the World Bank at some point in time, they had a hard time recognizing that even if you had a small square in the middle of a circle representing the earth and the square representing business, at some point you'd hit a restraint. And so therefore the president of the World Bank rejected that notion. Now, part of this should be recognized that it wasn't disdainful. It was done because of ignorance, such as dumping hazardous waste in the ground. I've been in a number of facilities, and of course, I was dealing with remediation of soil, remediation of groundwater, and he asked the question of the plant manager, why'd you do this? And he said, well, I just thought it would go right to the center of the earth. He had no idea that groundwater was there and that it migrated laterally, and the contamination he put on his property would go to his neighbor's property and it would be consumed if he had a well. It never dawned on him that would be the case. And I can't tell you the number of times where that was the response. And it wasn't necessarily a good rationalization. They really didn't believe it. So current state of play, designed for the environment, totally focused, reduce waste, eliminate persistent bioaccumulative and toxic materials, carcinogenic, mutagenic, teratogenic materials, So generally substituting non-hazardous for hazardous materials. However, in companies, and this question came to me, he said, look, Jim, what are you doing? Are you trying to save the world or save the company? And of course, my answer was both. But that's sort of the mindset. They have a hard time saying this anything more than a zero-sum game. And so therefore, there are some opportunities for continuing education in this area, although it's getting less and less. So the tools that were used, of course, Design for Sustainability provides better options. Life cycle assessment is a very powerful tool that understands the impact of those decisions almost at a compound by compound level. And you can structure that so you can do it within the confines of your operation. You can go from extraction to your operation, or you can do it literally from cradle to cradle. It's just a question of where you cast your focus, where you cast your boundaries, and then looking at what happens. And there's sometimes outcomes from this that are not intuitive. And that's where people are always shocked at sometimes the results that come from these. The other piece, of course, is dealing with people. You have to have stakeholder involvement. You have to engage in external dialogue. You need to identify the groups that are impacted by this, and you have to essentially start that dialogue. And there can be some great insights. Having done it myself, there are some really profound issues that are derived from these types of dialogues. So these types of stakeholder involvement. The other, of course, is symbiosis itself, having companies work together to utilize these byproducts. And there's some barriers to overcome, and we'll talk about those, but nonetheless, they're out there. So industrial ecology, of course, it's not about saving the planet. It's fine on its own. It's about saving us living on the planet. And it's not a making you feel bad, because feeling bad about the environment never changed much. It's about trying to find a way to give us a future. It's about survival. It's about finding solutions. And so therefore, that's the intent of this course. So how does your product, how does your industry achieve its place in the circular economy? So there are systems principles. It addresses long-term habitability. It looks at scope concerns in terms of regional, local, and global issues. It looks at how human activity can overwhelm natural systems. It looks at the resiliency of natural and human systems, but you have to protect that resiliency. You tend to use mass flow analysis. I can't tell you. It's a simple concept, and how much opposition there was to that, how much difficulty there was from people understanding what that meant and how it translated. And so therefore, it also views private firms as being key to mitigating this environmental impact. It's not just about doing good or having governments essentially manage something. It's really about going out. So in sum, industrial ecology is the science of sustainability. It looks to eliminate waste. It looks to align human activity within a natural cycle. And so therefore, it looks to optimize total materials utilization in the full life cycle component. And therefore, one other definition is it's anti-extinctionism, i.e. survival. So classic questions that come up all the time: is industrial ecology practical? Is it possible? How long will it take for this to be adopted by industry? How long will it take to be implemented? What would it look like if we did? And what happens if we don't? And of course, the answer to what we don't is, again, not just catastrophic, but apocalyptic. So it is a problem and something we have to be thoughtful of. Now itself, of course, is, let's see, I think we went through this, sorry. It's the comparison to biological ecology that I'd like to get to. So obviously a biological organism is capable of independent activity. It utilizes energy and materials. It's capable of reproduction. It responds to stimuli. It moves through stages of growth, and it has a finite life. So the classic question is, how does a factory compare? And if you stretch it, you probably can make an argument in each of those areas, including reproduction, because factories will grow and they will essentially be duplicated, perhaps someplace else, if they're successful. They certainly respond to stimuli. They certainly grow, and they have a finite lifetime. I mean, I've put facilities up around the world that have been subsequently knocked down again. I mean, it's hard to believe that there is that cycle that goes forward. I have to admit, when I built it, I thought it would last for a century or more. It didn't make 3 or 4. So Obviously, there are different types of views of ecosystems. Type 1 is unlimited resources, unlimited waste. Type 2 is limited energy and resource inputs, limited waste. And type 3 is biological ecology, which is a complete cycle of materials. It's a closed loop. And of course, you know, we're industrial operations. I think a lot of people think we're in type 1. We probably are in type 2, to be fair. And we're struggling to find our way through to type 3. This, of course, goes back to 94 itself. And clearly, it has to be taken with a certain amount of caution. Some economic analysis goes overboard, and so therefore they conclude that economic systems are not biological systems. But it's an analogy. It's something that we could learn from, really, and it's not meant to be, you know, a literal transformation of industrial systems, the biological systems. So biological ecology is a study of distribution and abundance of organisms and their interaction with the physical world. And industrial ecology is similar, and it focuses on the technological organism and how they use resources and what are their impacts and what are the ways they interact with the natural world, which could be restructured to enable global sustainability. So critiques, you know, Bob Ayers came out and said, look, there's no primary producer, there's no products, there's no markets, you know, and of course the classic question is, does it upend the analogy? And the answer is no. Bob was just being clever and smart. And, you know, again, he was trying to take the literal analogy without necessarily recognizing that it's meant to be a guide, not necessarily a strict effort. So are there growth? Yeah. Tools, energy, new materials, information, all those things grow. Scale of the action needs to be defined. Is an organism like a factory? Can we look at closed loop effort on resources? And just as there's interconnectedness of species, there can be, and there has been, interconnectedness with industrial operations. I mean, a lot of progress has been made since the 90s to essentially prove some of these things out. So the systems tools that we could find are material flow analysis, energy analysis, and symbiosis. There's no such thing as waste in the environment, classic. You know, it's only when we come up with anthropogenic materials that we find difficulties in natural systems, you know, dealing with them as a food source. So, you know, Jensen, Bass, and Leach all came up and said, look, there are some principles that can be used. So some of those principles of ecology can be applied to industry. Biological species will expand to fill their niche. Industrial systems will do the same. Evolution occurs in biological species. It certainly has happened with industry. We have moved away from just relying on in-pipe treatment. We're moving, thinking more comprehensively and more systematically. Perfection of the natural systems isn't always applicable. It took them literally millennia to develop, but we can essentially approximate that. And so therefore we have to avoid the preconceptions and understanding that industrial ecology is the ecology of industries. So you, again, want to avoid a simplistic view of biological ecology, recognize there is balance and harmony, and any species will exploit an ecological niche to expand until the resources are limited, or predators essentially limit the population. Humans are different because we can be made aware of that. We are aware of that, and we can self-correct if actions are taken in time. So there's hope, and there is an opportunity to, again, utilize biological analogies to industrial systems. I think with that, that's the end of this first lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care. Bye now.